In 1953, the CIA spent, well, roughly $1 million to help overthrow the government of Iran.
Which, I mean, by today's standards is basically nothing for a covert operation.
Right, exactly. But today, the economic and military fallout of U.S.-Iran tensions costs the global economy billions upon billions of dollars every single year.
It's massive.
It is. It's this geopolitical gridlock that really defines modern foreign policy. So how did one relatively cheap covert operation just snowball into a 70-year standoff?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Because if you've ever watched two nations trapped in this cycle of hostility, the human instinct is always to ask the exact same question, which is, who started it?
Right. We always crave a clean point of origin, a simple cause and effect to explain why things are broken.
A bad guy and a good guy.
Exactly. But taking that everyday instinct and applying it to international relations, well, it shatters any clean timeline. We are dealing with a deeply complex, multi-generational sequence of events here.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be unpacking the massive historical timeline between the United States and Iran today.
Drawing heavily on a really comprehensive document called Shadows of Sovereignty, the 7-decade U.S.-Iran conflict.
Yeah, and you are here because you want the thorough, mechanical understanding of how we got here without just drowning in information overload. We're going to trace the causality of this conflict from Cold War paranoia and covert coups to revolutions, proxy wars, and the extreme diplomatic whiplash of the 21st century.
But before we jump into that timeline, I do want to just clarify our parameters for a second.
Oh, yeah, please do.
The events detailed in Shadows of Sovereignty span multiple U.S. and Iranian administrations, and they involve some highly sensitive, highly polarizing actions. So our role here is strictly analytical.
Completely neutral.
Right. We are not taking sides, we aren't endorsing any political ideologies, and we definitely aren't litigating the morality of these historical events. We are impartially breaking down the facts, the mechanisms, and the causality as they're presented in the source material, just to help you map out the roots of this tension.
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand the absolute gridlock we see today, we really have to start at the foundational fracture. So we are jumping back to 1953.
Right into the thick of it.
Yep. So Iran had a democratically elected prime minister at the time, Mohammad Mossadegh, and he made a massive, highly controversial move. He nationalized Iran's oil industry.
Which before that had been controlled by the British through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company.
Right, and what's wild is how the West reacted.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is the actual mechanics of how the West responded to that nationalization, because it wasn't an immediate military invasion.
It would be economic, right?
Exactly. Britain initiated a devastating global embargo. They essentially blocked the international sale of Iranian oil, which just completely froze Iran's economy.
Because nationalizing the oil didn't suddenly make Iran wealthy.
No, not at all. It bankrupted the state because they just didn't have the global distribution network to sell it.
Okay, think of it like a tech startup suddenly seizing the physical servers from their massive cloud computing provider.
That's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, like you technically own your proprietary code, but without the global infrastructure to actually run it and distribute it to your users, your product is completely useless. So Iran had the oil, but the West controlled the shipping lanes, the tankers, and all the global refineries.
Right, and that economic strangulation really set the stage for political instability inside Iran.
Because the people are suffering.
Yes, and the U.S. CIA, alongside British intelligence, capitalized on that exact chaos to orchestrate a coup. It's often referred to as Operation Ajax.
Operation Ajax.
Right. They used this combination of bribing Iranian politicians, funding street protests, and working with sympathetic military officers to basically depose Mossadegh.
And the result of that was the restoration of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi.
Yeah, yes, an autocratic monarch who would reliably align with Western interests.
Wait, I have to push back on this 1953 narrative a bit, though.
Sure.
Was it really just about sheer corporate oil greed? Because we are talking about 1953 here. That is the absolute height of the Cold War.
Oh, absolutely.
Wasn't the U.S. administration just terrified that a completely bankrupt, unstable Iran, which shares a massive border with the Soviet Union, would just fall directly behind the Iron Curtain?
You're spot on. The Cold War calculus was absolutely the driving engine for Washington. I mean, President Truman had actually resisted British pressure to intervene earlier because he sympathized somewhat with Iranian nationalism.
Oh, really? I didn't know.
Yeah, but then when President Eisenhower took office in 1953, The lens shifted entirely to Soviet containment.
Huh, okay.
The fear was that a collapsing Iranian economy would empower the Tudeh party, which was Iran's communist faction. So the U.S. saw the coup as like a necessary geopolitical firewall against Soviet expansion.
But the unintended consequences of that firewall were just staggering. Like, yes, the U.S. successfully secured an anti-communist ally and they reestablished Western oil access, but they completely bypassed the long-term psychological impact on the Iranian public.
Oh, totally. They dismantled the democratic process to install a monarch.
Right, and you don't just erase that kind of interference.
No, you don't. That violation of national sovereignty became the central grievance of modern Iranian political thought.
And the Shah wasn't exactly a gentle ruler either.
Not at all. He rapidly consolidated power, utilizing a really brutal secret police force known as SAVAK. And the source notes that SAVAK was established with help from the CIA and Israeli intelligence.
Wow.
Yeah, and by violently suppressing secular political opposition, labor unions, independent media, basically any dissent over the next 2 decades, the Shah inadvertently created a massive political vacuum.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because of that suppression, the 1953 coup didn't just delay the conflict, right? It acted as a pressure cooker.
That's a great analogy.
Because by eliminating all the secular, democratic avenues for dissent, the Shah left really only one institution in Iranian society relatively untouchable.
The mosque.
Exactly. The religious network became the only viable infrastructure for political resistance to organize safely.
Which is wild to think about.
It is, and that causality is vital to understand. The religious nature of the 1979 explosion was directly dictated by the autocracy of the preceding 26 years.
The resentment just fermented.
Until it finally erupted into the Iranian Islamic Revolution, led by Ruhollah Khomeini. The Shah was overthrown, and Iran completely transformed into an Islamic republic.
With essentially anti-Americanism built right into its very constitutional DNA.
Exactly.
And the immediate aftermath of that revolution provided this visual that completely rewired the global perspective. In November 1979, militant Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran.
And they took 52 Americans hostage.
Yeah. And they didn't hold them for a weekend, they had them for 444 days.
Which is why 1979 is the true point of no return here. Like, 1953 was the fracture. But the hostage crisis severed formal diplomatic ties permanently. For the new Iranian government, capturing the embassy was a strategic move to consolidate power domestically.
And to prove their anti-imperialist credentials to their supporters.
Exactly. They utilized the hostages as leverage to prevent another 1953-style counter-coup.
I really want to look at the sheer length of that crisis, though, 444 days. And the mechanical effect it had on the United States.
It was profound.
It fundamentally shifted how Americans interacted with foreign policy. I mean, it literally birthed the modern 2047 news cycle.
Wait, really? How so?
Yeah. ABC News launched a nightly program literally called America Held Hostage, which eventually just became Nightline.
Oh, wow. I hadn't thought about that connection.
Yeah. The crisis dragged on for so long it basically destroyed Jimmy Carter's presidency. It turned Iran from this distant geopolitical chessboard into a visceral nightly news adversary for the average American sitting in their living room. And the trauma really became mutual at that point. The U.S. public felt humiliated and targeted, while Iran viewed its actions as completely justified retaliation for decades of U.S. interference.
Not to mention the U.S. harboring the deposed Shah at the time.
Right, exactly. So without an embassy and without direct diplomatic channels, the two nations lost the ability to communicate face-to-face.
Which meant the conflict was forced to mutate.
It had to.
Which means we enter a new era. From the 1980s through the 2000s, the battleground totally shifts. Since they aren't talking directly, the conflict fragments into indirect warfare and devastating financial battles.
Yes.
Let's look at the Iran-Iraq War, which kicked off in 1980 when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Iran-Iraq War defined the entire next phase of U.S.-Iran relations.
Because of what the U.S. did.
Right. The U.S. actively supported Iraq. They provided dual-use technology, economic aid, and critical satellite intelligence to Saddam Hussein's military.
Because Washington's goal was just to contain the spread of Iran's Islamic Revolution across the Middle East.
Right. Precisely.
But look at the message that sends to Tehran. I mean, by backing Iraq, which was an invading force widely known to be using chemical weapons against Iranian troops, Didn't the U.S. completely validate the most paranoid elements of Iran's post-revolution leadership?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, from their perspective, America was actively trying to annihilate them on the battlefield?
It absolutely solidified their worldview.
Yeah.
Iran learned a brutal lesson during that 8-year war, which was that they could not compete with Western-backed conventional armies.
The cost in human life was just catastrophic for them.
It was.
Yeah.
So Iran's military strategy adapted. They shifted away from conventional warfare and leaned heavily into asymmetric proxy warfare.
Meaning they stop fighting directly and start funding others to fight for them?
Precisely. They established the Quds Force, which is a branch of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, specifically designed to cultivate, fund, and arm non-state militant groups across the Middle East.
Like Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Yes, and various militias in Iraq and Syria, Hamas in Gaza. This allowed Iran to project power and strike at U.S. and allied interest while maintaining a layer of plausible deniability.
Because it's a highly cost-effective way to bleed a superior conventional adversary.
Exactly.
And the U.S. counters this proxy strategy not just with military force, but with a financial chokehold.
The sanctions.
Yeah, the U.S. began escalating economic sanctions. And we have to be clear for you guys about what modern sanctions actually look like. This isn't just slapping a tariff on imported pistachios.
No, the mechanics of the U.S. sanctions regime are incredibly aggressive. The U.S. utilizes what are called secondary sanctions.
How does this work, exactly?
Well, they essentially tell global banks and corporations, you can do business with the United States or you can do business with Iran, but you cannot do both.
Oh, wow.
And because the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency, almost every major international bank chose to sever ties with Iran.
I mean, they kind of have to.
Right. Eventually, Iranian banks were even disconnected from SWIFT, which is the global financial messaging system.
It's basically the geopolitical equivalent of freezing someone's bank accounts, cutting up their credit cards, and threatening anyone who even tries to lend them a dollar.
That's exactly what it is.
It's a grueling strategy of economic suffocation designed to force a change in behavior by just collapsing the internal economy. But this relentless pressure, the proxy wars, the financial isolation, eventually pushes the conflict into the ultimate existential stakes.
Because the 21st century introduces the nuclear variable.
Right.
In the early 2000s, it became clear Iran was heavily investing in a nuclear program. Now, while Iran claimed the program was strictly for civilian energy and medical research, the U.S. and its allies feared Iran was secretly developing the capability to build a nuclear weapon.
And if you look at it through the lens of the proxy strategy we just discussed, a nuclear weapon is the ultimate asymmetric shield.
Yes, it is.
If you feel surrounded by U.S. military bases and choked by all those secondary sanctions, a nuclear deterrent essentially guarantees regime survival. No one invades a nuclear power.
And that underlying logic sparked a decade of intense international alarm. The risks of a preemptive military strike by the U.S. or Israel against Iranian nuclear facilities was exceptionally high during this time.
Tensions were through the roof.
And the sanctions were dialed up to crippling levels, specifically targeting Iran's oil exports.
But then there's a massive pivot. The source details a major diplomatic breakthrough in 2015. Under President Obama, an agreement was reached between Iran, the U.S., and several other world powers.
The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
The JCPOA.
And the JCPOA was not a simple peace treaty. It was a highly technical, highly transactional framework.
What were the actual mechanics of it?
Well, they were strict. Iran agreed to physically dismantle thousands of advanced centrifuges, ship out the vast majority of its enriched uranium stockpile, and submit to the most intrusive 2047 inspection regime in the history of the International Atomic Energy Agency.
Wow.
Yeah, they effectively pushed their breakout time, which is the time needed to enrich enough material for one bomb from a few weeks to over a year.
And in exchange for dismantling their nuclear capability, Iran got what they desperately needed, which was sanctions relief.
Right.
Billions of dollars in frozen assets were unlocked, and they were temporarily allowed to sell their oil on the global market again. For a brief moment, it really looked like diplomacy actually worked. Tensions genuinely eased.
But the de-escalation was brief. The timeline then moves into the Trump administration, from 2017 to 2021, where the strategy violently reversed.
Right.
In 2018, the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA, despite international inspectors actually verifying that Iran was still complying with the technical limits of the deal.
And the U.S. reinstated all the heavy economic sanctions under a new campaign termed maximum pressure. The logic of maximum pressure being that the JCPOA was flawed because it only addressed the nuclear issue. It didn't stop Iran from funding those proxy militias across the Middle East, and it had, like, sunset clauses where the restrictions would eventually expire.
Yes, that was the rationale.
So the U.S. pulls out, squeezes the Iranian economy again, and tensions immediately skyrocket.
Iran responded by gradually abandoning the limits on its uranium enrichment, and the shadow war basically stepped out into the open.
It was no longer hidden?
Not at all. We saw oil tankers attacked in the Persian Gulf, U.S. drones shot down, and missile strikes on Saudi oil facilities.
Yeah.
The entire region was just a tinderbox.
And that tinderbox formally ignites in January 2020. The U.S. launches a targeted drone strike right outside the Baghdad airport, killing Qasem Soleimani.
Yes.
And he wasn't just some military officer. He was the commander of the Quds Force. He was the architect of the entire multi-decade proxy strategy we talked about earlier.
The assassination of Soleimani pushed the two nations to the absolute brink of direct conventional war. Iran retaliated by launching a barrage of ballistic missiles directly at U.S. military bases in Iraq.
Which was unprecedented.
Completely. The source highlights this specific period as the peak of modern volatility. Decades of painstaking, slow diplomacy were completely unwound, bringing the conflict back to its most primitive, militaristic state.
So what does this all mean? When we look at this phenomenon of diplomatic whiplash going from a landmark multi-nation nuclear agreement in 2015 to a lethal drone strike against a top state official in 2020, it reveals a really terrifying flaw in modern statecraft.
It does.
When foreign policy swings this violently from one U.S. administration to the next, how do you ever negotiate again?
That's the million-dollar question.
Like, if you are Iran, or honestly any other adversarial nation, how can you dismantle your ultimate leverage when you know the agreement might not even survive the next American election cycle?
That vulnerability is the crux of the modern dilemma here. Trust was already broken in 1953, it was buried in 1979, and repeatedly battered through the proxy wars of the 80s and 90s.
And then 2018 happens.
Right. The withdrawal from the JCPOA cemented a belief in Tehran that the United States is fundamentally incapable of honoring its diplomatic commitments.
Because administrations change.
Exactly. When treaties are treated as temporary truces tied to a specific administration, rather than binding agreements between sovereign states, the incentive for long-term concessions just evaporates. The unpredictability itself becomes a major driver of the tension.
It really is a staggering sequence of events. Let's trace the causality one last time for you guys.
Let's do it.
We started in 1953, where the Cold War calculus and the battle for oil led to a U.S.-backed coup, stripping Iran of its sovereignty and creating this massive political pressure cooker.
Right.
That cooker explodes in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution and the 444-day hostage crisis, which permanently traumatizes both nations and completely severs direct communication.
They stop talking entirely.
Yep. Forced into the shadows, the conflict mutates through the 1980s and 90s into devastating proxy wars and sweeping economic sanctions.
Which is the suffocation phase.
And that financial strangulation pushes Iran to develop nuclear leverage, leading to the precarious JCPOA deal of 2015, only to be torn up by 2018, culminating in the lethal drone strikes of 2020.
It is a compounding history. Returning to the core premise of our source material, the answer to the question, who started it, is inherently fractured.
There's no easy answer.
No, there is no isolated mistake. The tension is a living, breathing ecosystem of inherited grievances. It's a sequence of actions and reactions spanning 70 years, where every move taken by one side to secure its own interests inadvertently arms the paranoia of the other.
Every single action just justifies the other's mistrust.
This raises an important question, perhaps the most critical takeaway from mapping out this entire timeline.
What's that?
Well, this conflict is over 7 decades old. It has completely outlived its founders.
That's a wild thought.
It is. The intelligence officers who plotted Operation Ajax, the politicians who nationalized the oil, the students who stormed the embassy, the vast majority of the original decision-makers are gone.
Yeah.
So how does a nation break a systemic cycle of hostility when the foundational grievances are inherited by entirely new generations? When the people navigating the geopolitical gridlock today weren't even alive when the conflict began, is historical memory itself a permanent barrier to peace?
That is the exact kind of heavy mechanical question we want to leave you with today. If the original spark is extinguished, but the structural fire is still burning, how do you safely dismantle the building?
It's not easy.
Not at all. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We
Yeah.
hope unpacking the mechanics of this 70-year timeline gave you the clarity to look at today's headlines with a completely different perspective.
Absolutely.
Keep questioning the causality behind the news, keep exploring the roots of global conflict, and remember, the next time you find yourself wondering who started a geopolitical standoff, you have to look far beyond the immediate crisis.
You have to follow the thread all the way back to the fracture.
Take care, everyone.